Well, thank you all for coming. It's a good turnout today, it looks like. So this is my teaching on dialectic, self-consciousness, and unfreedom. So how this is going to work is I'm going to read through the script I prepared here, and I've got some diagrams to go with the teaching, and I will refer to them at the appropriate times. As you can see, there's 6 different sort of sections to this teaching. So first I'm going to read a general summary just so you get an idea of where the teaching's going to go, and then I'm going to read each section. If you have any clarificational questions, feel free to ask them in between the sections, but if you have any questions, like broader questions about the subject matter, please save them till the very end. Okay? All right. The Platypus Affiliated Society, established in December 2006, organizes reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, new 1960s to 70s, and post-political 1980s to 90s left for the possibilities of emancipatory politics today. I'm here to talk to you about the meaning of the dialectic, especially as it relates to Hegel's philosophy and orthodox Marxist theory, and the sense given by Lukács. There's a dual character to the reasons for this presentation. First, I wish to make less obscure the nature of the dialectic as both a method for thinking and also a description of the way things actually are, and especially the ways in which this differs between Hegel and Marx. In addition to an exposition for newer students of the dialectic, I also address some issues commonly encountered by people more familiar to the dialectical tradition. Less well-initiated students may safely ignore the occasional references to Kant, along with other obscure asides. The second point of this talk is to draw out a thread running through Platypus's pedagogy that is deeply important to the story Platypus tells about history, but which can be esoteric. Namely, that the dialectic is just the coming to be of self-consciousness in history. Indeed, the necessity with which the subject's consciousness of its object should become self-consciousness will be seen to be just the necessity of the realization of freedom. A note before I describe the path this teaching will take. I by no means exhaust the consideration of the dialectic in this teaching, and especially as the dialectic presents itself as a task and an obstacle for us in the present. In the first section, we will see that the dialectic is driven by the need for the recognition of the identity of thought and being, as well as expounding on the nature of the dialectic, and especially its various moments. This section is particularly crucial for the talk, and particularly the speculative nature of the dialectic. In the second section, we will begin to explore Hegel's system and investigate more in depth the relation in which the dialectic stands to Hegel's Encyclopaedia logic. We will see that the 3 moments of the dialectic correspond to Hegel's system in a nested triad structure. 3 books of the system correspond to the 3 moments of the dialectic, as do the 3 doctrines of the logic. We will see that the identity between thought and being implies that the so-called logical idea, the pinnacle of Hegel's logic, expresses the unity of subject and object. In other words, the mediation of the subject by their object is nothing other than the self-mediation of that subject-object, i.e. the idea. We will also see that things are only rendered as unified in and through their course of development. In this way, Hegel's philosophy is the end of philosophy, and that through its course of development, philosophy has come to the self-consciousness, or self-mediation, of everything that is. In the third section, we will explore expositions of topics from the 3rd book of Hegel's system, the philosophy of spirit. From the philosophy of history, we see that the development of the idea in history is the development of freedom according to reason. This freedom in its highest form is nothing other than the relationship the subject has to its object under the idea, or the relationship of speculative unity. The philosophy of right theoretically explicates what this unity, or self-consciousness, looks like. It takes the form of the bourgeois state, which objectifies universal reason in itself. Thus, society, in coming to self-consciousness of itself in the bourgeois state, reaches the end of history. The fourth section explicates the development in history that allows for Marx's development on Hegel. This development is the movement of the objective production process of society through the rise of capital. In this way, the subject and object, which were formerly unified, come to be sheared off from each other, as the industrial forces of production come to outstrip bourgeois social relations. I also detail the relation that Marx stands in relation to Hegel, and especially with respect to the dialectic. Primarily, Marx takes up Hegel in a totally historicized form, going beyond Hegel's system as a consummation of a development that stands over and above history. The fourth section shows how Marx's theorizing stands in a negative relation to Hegel. On the other hand, the fifth shows that this negative relation is a determinate negation, and so Marx's relationship to Hegel is dialectical. The objective movement of society and history has made Hegel's philosophy pass into its opposite, a la Marx, whereby the history of freedom becomes the history of barbarism. Marx shows that can and should be part of a greater dialectical unity. The objective movement of society may yet render humanity absolutely free through its political self-consciousness. The final section, firstly, discusses the finer points of the relationship between Hegelian and Marxist dialectics, and in the same vein touches on the relationship between theory and practice. This leads into the final point, where I discuss the transcendence of the dialectic beyond capitalism. Okay, the first section, the dialectic and the identity between thought and being. This first diagram is associated with section 1. We will begin by discussing Hegel's philosophical project, starting with the phenomenology of spirit. Hegel's goal in this work is to begin with naive, natural consciousness and work his way up to philosophical consciousness in a scientific manner. There are two questions pertinent here. What is philosophical consciousness, and what is the nature of this scientific development? Firstly, the nature of this development is a supposedly presuppositionless one, insofar as Hegel only presupposes what is already present for natural or naive consciousness. This consciousness is not merely awareness, but the ability to know something. It therefore has in itself a standard which it measures things by. When I say I know something, for example, I know I ate eggs for breakfast today, I only say so because I have reasons that I know this. Whether or not these reasons are sufficient is the standard that I measure my knowledge by. For example, I might say I know this because I witnessed myself eating eggs. But insofar as consciousness knows things, it can also know itself, and thus it can measure itself by its own standard. This is, for example, the task the Socratic method sets for itself, to evaluate whether a position is founded upon an appropriate use of reason by using reason to evaluate itself. To an interlocutor holding a position, Socrates would pose questions in the guise of clarifying their position. In this way, he would lead them to realize the very positions they held were not consistent with themselves. Thus, consciousness develops itself through itself. It measures itself by its own standard, shows that it does not measure up to its own standard, and thus must develop itself to be in line with this standard. However, this development is not a merely negative one, or a skepticism of one's ability to know. Indeed, Hegel puts it thus: it is upon this difference between the object of knowledge and knowledge, which is present, that the testing depends. If in this comparison the two do not correspond to one another, then it seems as if consciousness must alter its knowing in order to make it adequate to the object. However, in knowing's alteration, the object itself is, to consciousness, also in fact altered. For the knowing which is present was essentially a knowing of the object. Along with the knowing, the object also becomes something different, for it belonged essentially to this knowing, from the phenomenology of spirit. In other words, what it means to know changes as this development proceeds. And so what it means to know one's own consciousness also develops. Thus, this development can repeat itself insofar as developing the form of consciousness also develops consciousness's own standard of knowledge. Those familiar with Hegel will recognize this as an example of the dialectic, which we will return to in a moment. Regarding the former question, that is, what is philosophical consciousness, that we asked at the beginning, Hegel answers that it is the consciousness that is able to grasp both thought and being, our ability to think the world and the existence of the world as being essentially identical with each other, as moments of a single totality. This identity is not merely a mathematical identity or the Leibnizian identity of indiscernibles. That is, that one cannot tell the two apart. Indeed, it means something very different to say, I think X, than X is. Thus, when taken on their own, thought and being are quite different from each other. But in relationship to the totality of which they are a part, they are the same, in that one overturns into the other. One can get a concrete idea of what this means by looking at the example provided by Hegel himself, namely the identity between our consciousness of the object and the object itself. In other words, the way an object appears to us and the way an object actually is are, in the final analysis, identical to each other. This is not to say we know everything about the world, but rather that an object can only be an object if it is an object for us. More specifically, in the case of the phenomenology, we come to the conclusion that consciousness's consciousness of itself as an object, or its self-consciousness, is identical to what consciousness actually is. One can compare this to Kant's transcendental unity of apperception, or the Cartesian I think, therefore I am. The conclusion of this development in a consciousness that recognizes the identity between thought and being shows why Hegel calls this development scientific, insofar as it comes to justify itself along with its own method, namely the dialectic. For Hegel, the dialectic takes on a specific form and content. Quote, I know that it is the only true method. This is self-evident simply from the fact that it is not something distinct from its object and content, for it is the inwardness of the content, the dialectic which it possesses within itself, which is the mainspring of its advance. It is clear that no expositions can be accepted as scientifically valid which do not pursue the course of this method and do not conform to its simple rhythm, for that this is the course of the subject matter itself, from the science of logic. This is to say, firstly, that the dialectic proceeds immanently through the standard that the content sets for itself. For example, refer back to the self-evaluation of reason posed by Socrates. Secondly, the dialectic is dialectical. It shows how this content is in contradiction with its own standard. Continuing the example, through asking his opponent to clarify their position, Socrates makes his interlocutor admit their own inconsistency. Thirdly, the dialectic is a method of development in and through this standard, insofar as the self-contradiction must be resolved, this contradiction between the content and its standard. Thus, the dialectic presupposes nothing but the content which it aims to develop, and does not search for external solutions or methods to impose upon the content. Indeed, it is, quote unquote, the inwardness of the content. However, one cannot take this for granted. To suppose that something can set a standard for itself, the content must appear to have a standard. This appearance of having a standard is an appearance to us as subjects, and is thus thought. Indeed, the only way something can be an object for us is if it appears a certain way to us. Thus, this appearance, or thought, is in a certain sense identical with the fact that the content is, or its being. Thus, the recognition of the identity of thought and being drives and accounts for the possibility of the dialectic, which itself justified the identity between thought and being through the development Hegel presents. This self-justification and self-grasping is what Hegel means by scientific. To be clear, this is not a fallaciously circular self-justification. On the contrary, Hegel only assumed as his object naive consciousness, or what consciousness that has not yet reflected upon itself already contained from the outset. Rather, this scientific self-justification is the ability for philosophical consciousness to account for its starting point at the end of its development. It does not come to oppose its starting point and course of development, but rather is able to understand and account for them. More on the form of the Hegelian dialectic. In the Encyclopaedia Logic, Hegel describes the dialectical method as follows. With regard to its form, the logical has three sides. A, the side of abstraction, or the understanding. B, the dialectical, or negatively rational side. And C, the speculative, or positively rational one from the Encyclopaedia Logic. We've already seen these three moments in the preceding exposition of the dialectic as 1, immanent, 2, dialectical, and 3, developing the content. But I will expound further on this. Firstly, we have the side of the abstraction or of the understanding, also known as the immediate moment of the content. This is simply the content as it is given, taken as determinate and fixed for the moment. The understanding in question is the same as the Kantian understanding, which cleanly demarcates its concept. Whereas by abstract, Hegel means one-sided or undeveloped. Next, we have the dialectical or negatively rational side, also known as the mediated moment or the negation of the first moment. This is the content as it overturns into its opposite. It fails to measure up to its own standard, and so through the process of thinking the content, it posits something other than itself that successfully measures up to its standard. I again encourage you to think of Socrates, where in questioning his opponent, he gets them to admit that their position implies the opposite of their position. The difference here with skepticism is that it is not merely a negative no to the initial content, but a positive yes to its own standard also. And so we have the so-called determinate negation of the content, or the negation grasped as a new content. But this negation is the negation of something. It only is what it is through its opposite. Thus it has a unity with its opposite, in that they are part of a greater totality. Thus we come to the speculative or positively rational side, also known as the immediately mediated or self-mediated moment, and that it contains its mediating opposite within itself. Hegel also refers to this as the negation of negation, insofar as the contradiction or self-opposition has been resolved. Thus we see that the content gives its opposite in accordance with its own standard. The content and its opposite are thus part of a greater totality, where one thing immanently overturns into its opposite and vice versa. Hegel also calls this moment the concrete, in that it is a totality more richly and fully determined than the abstract or one-sided. Thus the dialectic is speculative, and that it comes to recognize the identity of separate moments through their difference. To use the proper terminology, the process of development of the content into something more concrete is called sublation or Aufhebung, a term which has many meanings which all describe various aspects of this process. All right, I know that was a lot. Do we have any clarificational questions? I can also explain the first diagram, if that would be helpful. Yeah, okay, so, and sorry for the people on Zoom, just refer to the first diagram on the image that was sent. So we have, at the top is just a simple representation of the dialectic. The two moments, the abstract and the negative, as they pass, okay, as they overturn into each other. So the abstract is something, it's just taken as it is, but it's shown to overturn into its opposite because it comes into conflict with its own standard that it sets for itself. So, like the Socrates example, I'm giving an argument, Socrates is questioning me. He says, well, why do you think such and such? And I say, whatever. But I come to the conclusion that I come to the conclusion that I'm contradicting myself. And so I come to the negative, which is the opposite. And so the Socratic dialectic is insufficient for a number of reasons, but that's sort of an example of how one thing can posit its own standard and it can overturn into its opposite. But we see through the fact that these two contradictory things like pass back and forth into each other, that they transcend themselves to a third moment, which encompasses the initial two, the concrete moment. So the second image in the diagram is just prefiguratory for the next diagram. It's just how I'm representing the dialectic. And this has, this table is just a chart of different moments of the dialectic. So This is the left column is the abstract in relation to reason, aspect of reason, an aspect of critique, an aspect of immediacy, an aspect of sidedness. So it's associated with the understanding. It's associated with immanence. It is the immediate moment, and it is associated with sort of the one-sided. The negative is associated with dialectic, contradiction, mediatedness, and otherness, the other to its initial moment. 1 second. The concrete is associated with speculative reason. This is the speculative moment, or sublation. It is self-mediated in that it contains its other within itself. So the abstract and the negative are opposites of each other, but they're both contained within the concrete. And finally, we come to totality, which is what the concrete moment is. All right, hang on.
Would that like?
So we can come back to the sum, but in one sense it is more, it is closer to the truth. But I'll come back to what truth means for Hegel in a little bit.
Oh, growth, right?
Well, the concrete it's a process. It's the overturning of the abstract and the negative into each other.
The process is always going on.
Never like. It is a process of continually going back and forth.
Okay, yeah. So the concrete is the overturning of the abstract and the negative.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
The concrete is the overturning of the abstract.
Right, because I feel like a way you could misunderstand this is that you view it as a kind of linear progression.
No,
you go from abstract and then negative, and at the top is concrete.
You might have heard thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Yeah.
That's wrong.
Right. Yeah.
It's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
And so that's why this chart is great, because it's the concrete is coming out of the two arrows.
Yes, it is the process of going back and forth. Well, it is the process in a certain sense. It is a product, but it is the process also. And also, I know you just came in. We're just doing clarificational questions now. If you've got any broader ones.
Yeah. One clarification I wanted to make or ask was the concrete result of this process, or the concrete moment itself, is an abstract for another, or is that?
It can be, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And then the second clarification, I guess, not necessarily clarification, but like, not to conflate terms, can you give a concrete example of like an argument or something in which this process would take?
Well, I can give you an example in the form of Hegel and Marx. So when we get to Marx, this will become a lot clearer.
Perfect.
Okay. Any other clarificational questions, or can I move on to the next session?
Sure. Well, you're mentioning Socrates, but also so Plato is also kind of related in that same sphere. I guess Socrates and Plato are very close.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if you wanted to.
Let's save that sort of question for the very end. Let's save that for the very end, because that's less clarificational. So the next section, the Encyclopaedia logic, self-mediation, and the idea. Let me take a sip of water. That's how I'm going to wait for people. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Oop. Hang on. I got to get this diagram back up on the screen. All right. We're going to move on to the next diagram. So the relevant diagram for this section and the next section is the second diagram, which is sort of the tree is composing the Hegel system diagram. Okay. We now come to Hegel's system, or the development of the various forms the idea takes. As a logical category, the idea is the speculative unity of the subject and the object. Or in other words, the idea is the active process by which subject and object, as opposed moments, unceasingly overturn into each other and thus are also moments of a greater totality. To quote Hegel, the idea is the process of disrupting itself into individuality and into the latter's inorganic nature, and of then bringing this inorganic nature again under the controlling power of the subject and back to the first simple universality. The identity of the idea with itself is one with the process, but the idea, because of the freedom which the concept has attained in it, also has the most stubborn opposition within it. Its repose consists in the assurance and the certainty with which it eternally generates that opposition and eternally overcomes it, and in it rejoins itself, from the Science of Logic. Hegel's Encyclopaedia is divided into 3 sections, itself corresponding to the 3 moments of the dialectic. There is the logic, the development of the idea on its own grounds, the philosophy of nature, the development of the idea as something other than itself, or something which appears contradictory or opposed to the aforementioned unity on its own accord, and the philosophy of spirit, Hegel's account of the return of the idea's otherness in nature back into itself, mirroring the development of man as the rational animal, as himself arising from nature and coming to know it. Of primary concern to us here is the logic, along with certain expositions of categories from the philosophy of spirit. We have seen that the phenomenology ends by showing that thought, or the consciousness of an object, requires the idea as an operative category. He has shown that thought and being are speculatively identical. Hegel then asks, what is required to think or understand an object? This is the sense in which the logic is a logic, and that it presents the categories for anything whatsoever to be intelligible, the categories necessary for thought. But the aforementioned identity between thought and being implies that this is also a metaphysics. The categories of thinking are the same as the categories of being. Thus, Hegel is also posing the question of what it means for anything whatsoever to be. Hegel starts out his logic and system by taking pure thought as his starting point. Pure in the sense that one is thinking only about thought itself. Thought in its immediacy, or pure givenness, can be expressed as I think, or thought is. This itself already requires that something is. And here we have the starting point of the category of pure being. For anything to be thought at all, something must be, kind of a truism. This is immediate and indeterminate being, that is, being as undeterminated, or literally not limited from something else, which is to say, it does not stand in relation to anything else, and thus nothing can be said about it except that it is. Here, since as a starting point our thought is already philosophical in the sense that we came to through the phenomenology, that is, it recognizes the identity between thought and being, we have at hand the fact that the standards which thought sets for its categories are also the standards the categories set for themselves. Thus, indeterminate being is seen to be completely without content, as purely undetermined by anything. And so through its own immanent development, posits that it is nothing by its own internal standard. Thus, we have nothing as the opposite or the negation of the category of being. But then we see that the passing over from pure being into nothing is itself one thing becoming something else. The unity of the 2 categories is therefore the category of becoming. This also shows more clearly how the dialectic drives both thought and being. In the example given before, the Socratic method was merely a method of developing one's thoughts and positions. On the contrary, the Hegelian dialectic is also inherent in objects themselves, insofar as they are appearances for us. To quote Hegel, everything around us can be regarded an example of dialectic. For we know that, instead of being fixed and ultimate, everything finite is alterable and perishable. And this is nothing but the dialectic of the finite, through which the latter, being implicitly the other of itself, is driven beyond what it immediately is and overturns into its opposite. A planet is now in this position, but it also has it in itself to be in another position, and through its motion brings this, its otherness, into existence, from the Encyclopaedia Logic. In this way, 2 initial categories are seen to be the same when considered distinctly as moments of the third. Something can only become something else if the being of one becomes the being of the other, and the non-being or nothing of one becomes the nothing of the other. The relations in this sphere of being are simple and immediate, and the categories are seen to simply be without requiring mediation or relation to another. Thus, Heraclitus could say that the nature of everything is to become, without affirming that things could be. But at the end of the sphere of being, the categories reveal by their own standard that mere immediacy is insufficient for an entity to be or to be thought. It must be mediated by something other than itself. Thus, the sphere of being, or immediacy, overturns into the sphere of essence, or mediation, through which everything only is because of its relationship to another. While the sphere of being reflected the first moment of the dialectic, where things simply are, the sphere of essence reflects the second moment, whereby everything contains within itself relation to something else, opposed to it. For example, the first category within the sphere of essence is that of identity, or of the relationship of one thing to itself as its own other. When we say x equals x, we relate x to itself. But in this relation, we already distinguish something, the first x, from itself, the second x. And so identity as a category only makes sense through distinction. For example, A is not equal to B. But again, distinction requires that something be delimited from something else. A circle is only a circle because there is an outside to that circle. The fact that the outside of the circle only can be because there is an inside, and vice versa, means there is a necessary sameness or identity between the two. A equals B. Thus, identity and distinction only make sense because they are opposed to each other. Finally, something being merely mediated or related to something else is seen to be immanently, or through the content's own standard, insufficient. And so the sphere of essence overturns into the sphere of the concept. The concept is that which is immediately mediated, or self-mediated. It contains non-identical opposing moments within itself, as speculatively identical, mirroring the third moment of the dialectic. Recall that speculative identity is identity through difference. Such is the case when Aristotle says that an organism only is what it is through its various parts, and vice versa. A heart is only a heart and can only be understood as what a heart is, in the true sense, if it is pumping blood as an intact part of a living organism. In other words, it only is what it is because an organism is a self-mediating totality. It is a self-mediating totality precisely in that a heart only needs to be adequate to itself as its own concept. Or to put it another way, it is mediated by its own internal standard of itself. Thus, the relation between categories in this sphere is the sameness of things through their differentiation. For example, the sameness of the heart and its purpose through its concept. This sphere culminates in the idea as itself the concept of the concept, or the internal unity between the subject as concept and the object. This unity will come to be seen as crucial for Hegel's conception of history. This is the self-mediation of the concept in that the subject comes to know and act upon itself as an object, that the concept as subjectivity externalizes itself into objectivity through its own internal standard. Additionally, in the final stage of the development of the idea, we see that the absolute idea, as this final stage, is the same as the process of development of the logical system in its totality. The culmination of the logic is thus the fact that to understand anything whatsoever, or for anything to be whatsoever, requires the entire development of the logic. In other words, logical and metaphysical coherence requires relation to the totality as its most important characteristic. You need a drink of water. For Hegel, truth is what it is because it is the relation of something to the totality. Nothing makes sense except in relation to totality. To quote Hegel, the true is the whole. However, the whole is only the essence completing itself through its own development, from the Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel thus sees things as being what they are essentially through their own dialectical development. and that this development is consummated only when it has reached the stage of a unity between subject and object that sums up this development itself, that contains its entire curriculum vitae within itself, and consciously apprehends itself as such. It is thus his science and its method that is itself the absolute idea. Thus, in declaring his own philosophy to be the end of philosophy, he is declaring that his philosophy is in fact the self-conscious development of all preceding philosophy. That is, his philosophy is both philosophy in general, as well as being the end of the development of philosophy. He achieves this by coming to awareness of the idea. Quote Hegel, everything which, taken by itself, appears to be restricted gets its value by belonging to the whole and being a moment of the idea. This is how we have had the content, and what we now have is the knowledge that the content is the living development of the idea. And this simple looking back is contained in the form, from the Encyclopaedia Logic. In other words, philosophy has had a guiding thread, and the object, the course of development, and the subject, philosophy as conscious thought, are identical in his philosophy, as philosophy consummated. Thus, in arguing that the subject's consciousness of the object is really only its consciousness of itself, his philosophy attains the highest possible level of philosophical self-consciousness, since it is the consciousness of everything that is, as object, as itself, as subject. It is the self-consciousness of everything that is. Okay, clarificational questions. Yeah.
There's a sentence, finally something being merely mediated or related to something else is seen to be eminently insufficient. Why?
Sorry? What?
The first line of this paragraph, finally something being merely mediated or related to something else is seen to be eminently insufficient. Why? Like why is that so?
Hang on, let me search for this in my document to see the context.
There's no page numbers. It's
this is the passing into the sphere of the concept, right? So
Right.
we've got the Hegel system diagram. We've got the logic, the nature, and the spirit. Those are the books of his philosophy. And then the doctrines of the logic are the being, essence, and the concept. It is the project of Hegel's logic is to show exactly this fact that you're asking. I mean, I don't want to be like, go read the book, but like
Right.
it's kind of like the whole development is him showing step by step why this is true.
Okay. Got
So,
it. So go read the book.
yeah, basically.
No.
I mean, but like, hang on, I do want to give a more serious answer to this other than like, go read the book. Like, it's only about 250. We're actually reading it this summer, right now. Yeah, you can come join us. That's my little self-advertisement for Platypus. All right. But the final step is sort of like there's the sphere of within the sphere of essence. There's essence, appearance, and actuality. Actuality is sort of the unity of essence and appearance. So essence makes itself apparent through the appearances of objects. So like in actuality is just essence becoming appearance, and then I mean it's sort of the development of the essence of things continually coming out of it itself into appearance. I don't know if that makes it any clearer.
Right. What I was more curious about is the part that says eminently insufficient.
Okay, so by its own standard.
Right.
So the point Hegel is making is that, well, there's we live. I mean, the basic reason why Hegel's saying this is because we live in a world where man completely determines himself, and so all things are can be measured by our own standards. At least that's the point he would want to make. That we can, through reason, we're completely.
Okay.
I mean, that's particularly through reason, is that we can determine ourselves completely through reason.
No, that did help. Thank you.
Yeah, Art. It's on. Okay. Any more clarification? Yeah.
When it comes to like the relationship between the subject and the object, just to clarify, the subject is like the person, and like the object.
Subject. So a subject is a free actor. To be a subject means to be something that can act upon something freely. So people, Hegel would want to say people are subjects. That's a little more contentious for Marx because of the world we live in is in some sense unfree. But for Hegel, people are subjects. And he argues why we're free. And I'll get to why we're free subjects in the next section. But yeah.
Just want to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Can I ask one of my platypodes to run and get me some more water? Thank you. All right. So if there's no more questions, we'll move on to the next section. The philosophy of spirit, freedom in history. How then does Hegel conceive of history and its relationship to philosophy? That is, his philosophy. The answer is once again that it is the self-development of the idea, but this time in the sphere of society as the development of freedom. As Hegel puts it, the idea of freedom is the nature of spirit and the absolute goal of history. From the lectures on the philosophy of history. What is freedom for Hegel? He puts it as follows. Freedom is being at home with oneself and one's other, depending upon oneself, and being one's own determinant. In all drives, I begin with an other, with what is for me something external. Hence we speak of dependence in this case. Freedom is only present when there is no other for me, that is not myself, from the Encyclopaedia Logic. This is just the relationship between the positive and negative moments of the dialectic, their speculative unity, which in its highest form is the unity of the subject and object in the idea. To be free, we must be measured by the idea, and to be measured by the idea is to be free. To be at home with oneself, with one's object, is simply to say that one recognizes oneself in the object. In the same way, one's home is an extension of the self. In other words, history is the course of development of the subject and object being at home with themselves in each other. This is the historical realization of what philosophy apprehends in Hegel as the unity of the idea after the fact. To quote, philosophy, as the thought of the world, does not appear until reality has completed its formative process and made itself ready. Only in the maturity of reality does the ideal appear as counterpart to the real, apprehends the real world in its substance, and shapes it into an intellectual kingdom. From the philosophy of right. More specifically, Hegel argues that history is the development of freedom according to reason, as freedom is merely being at home with oneself and one's other, a lack of limitation of the object on the subject, or of the world on the human, the ability to act without being dominated by the contingency of the merely natural world. But because the object and conditions of exercising freedom are given in advance historically, a merely contingent freedom of choice is self-contradictory, and that one's actions remain determined by material circumstances. Thus, freedom can only come to be if one is governed by oneself in the face of contingent circumstances, or if one sets one's own necessary laws to follow through reason, as reason belongs essentially to spirit. To quote Hegel, man is an object of existence in himself only in virtue of reason, which, in view of its activity and power of self-determination, is called freedom, from the lectures on the philosophy of history. And again, the will that is genuinely free is conscious of its content as something steadfast and for itself, and at the same time, it knows the content to be utterly its own, from the Encyclopaedia Logic. Thus, the freedom of the idea, or the idea of freedom, becomes manifest in history because history develops as a whole according to reason. It culminates in a society that is dictated by its own self-legislated laws. In other words, society objectifies itself in the world through a state that dictates laws for, in, and through society by society's own reason. It is important to note that this development is not a conscious development. Hegel, of course, doesn't argue that the actors of history were aware that history was developing towards the realization of reason. This unconscious development is what Hegel calls the ruse that reason plays behind the back of its historical actors. Importantly, the reason of society embodied in the state is, or ought to be, universal. It is just the same as the reason governing individuals, insofar as man acts rationally. In this way, the constitution of the bourgeois state is what allows Hegel to declare that his moment is the end of history, and that the rational and free idea is realized in it. To quote Hegel, the state is absolutely rational, inasmuch as it is the actuality of the substantial will, which it possesses in the particular self-consciousness, once that consciousness has been raised to consciousness of its universality. This substantial unity is an absolute unmoved end in itself, in which freedom comes into its supreme right, from the philosophy of right. Okay, clarificational questions.
I'll try to read it. It's kind of a long sentence, but because the object and its conditions of exercising freedom are given in advance.
Can you speak a little louder?
Oh yeah. But because the object and conditions of exercising freedom are given in advance historically, a merely contingent freedom of choice is self-contradictory. Like, what? Can you clarify that?
Yeah, I mean, I clarify that in the following sentences a little. I mean, like if everything is sort of like, we can give a natural scientific description of the world, right? And so like it's either deterministic up to a point, or it's just random. I mean, we're not going to get into the issues of quantum mechanics here, but I mean, the point is that there's sort of fixed laws that determine us in advance. Given our historical conditions, one can project forward what happens. So if you're just free to choose, are you really free to choose? If all of the things that have happened before just determine what you do?
Yeah.
Yes?
Are you asking me a question?
Yeah.
Oh, it's not.
Yeah, so that's why it's contradictory.
Yeah.
So there's got to be something more to it, at least according to Hegel.
Thank you.
Determinism, however to say that.
Yeah,
Okay.
Hegel would make the point that freedom and determinism are not contradictory with each other, or rather, they are contradictory in a positive way. They are speculatively identical.
Okay.
One can be free through determinism still.
I've heard of something called super determinism. Maybe that's more of a modern or scientific thing. But
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I'm curious if you can expand upon what gave Hegel the confidence to say that bourgeois society was the end of history for his own time.
Can we save this? Can you write down this question and save it till the end, because this sounds like something I want to get more in depth into.
No problem.
Okay, cool.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to ask, related to your question, I forget your name. 8, sorry. Which is, if you could expand on this idea here, which is, thus freedom can only come to be if one is governed by oneself in the face of contingent circumstances.
Yeah. And so it's the in the face of that you're asking about.
Right.
That's sort of what I was saying over there, is that despite external circumstances, one is determined by oneself. What is that way in which one is determined by oneself? Well, like Hegel said, it's determined through reason. Through our own reason, we are determined. And so even though like there's these like natural laws dictating the world around us, I'm determined through reason. And so I am free because it's my own reason.
Right, but I also take this to be material circumstances in the sense of you don't choose the historical moment you're born into.
Sure.
Sense that you don't choose the contingent circumstances.
Yeah.
Side you're born into. But that part of what in the face of means is that we become conscious of the fact that we're the product of a historical process.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
and we could save this too.
Yeah. This
Yeah, yeah.
this is something I'm going to have to think more about.
Okay,
And
yeah.
questions where I have to think about giving the answer that are not clarificational questions, we'll save till the end. So we're now at the final diagram for these next two sections. And I will get into that more. Perhaps at the end of section 5, because, yeah. Okay. The Marxian turn, or the negative moment of capital. For Marx, however, Hegel's philosophy is insufficient to measure up to its own internal standards. This is not a mere thought error. When Marx describes Hegel as making errors or falling into illusion, he never means this undialectically, or in a sense where Hegel merely made logical or factual mistakes. Rather, he understands Hegel to be in a situation in which history has rendered his philosophy internally insufficient. As Marx says, it is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness. From a contribution to a critique of political economy. Marx takes seriously what Hegel establishes in the logic. Everything, and namely consciousness, is only what it is through mediation by another. What one does in their real life process conditions the consciousness that can be had of oneself. In Hegel's case, Marx argues that his position is grounded in the same standpoint and method of the classical political economists, namely that of revolutionary bourgeois consciousness. Thus, Marx says that Hegel necessarily, quote, fell into the illusion of conceiving the real as the product of thought, unfolding itself out of itself by itself, whereas the method of rising from the abstract to the concrete is only the way in which thought reproduces it as concrete in the mind, from the Grundrisse. Marx thereby understood that the logic was methodologically the process of proceeding from the most abstract or one-sided possible thought, a supposedly presuppositionless pure thought of being, towards the absolute, and what appears at the end as the process of thought's own unfolding sequence of categories being rendered concrete, or as moments of the totality. However, Marx's point is that the historically given totality is itself the starting point in reality, which conditions all abstract categories in thought. Indeed, Hegel's logic is itself circular, and that he himself acknowledges that each moment of his system is only what it is as a moment of the whole development. Each category presupposes every other category in the development. Yet Hegel could not move beyond this to grasp the givenness of thought itself, since philosophy attempts merely to understand what already is by its nature, the eternal over the merely historical. As Marx says, man's reflections on the forms of social life, and consequently also his scientific analyses of these forms, seeks to decipher not their historical character, for in his eyes they are immutable, but their meaning, from Capital. A quick aside on the distinction between system and method. The method of the Hegelian dialectic, indeed the dialectic in general, demands totality, demands systematicity. However, when this system is taken as systematic, as in Hegel, or as eternally all-encompassing, it loses its ability to grasp history. Engels puts it as follows. However much Hegel, especially in his logic, emphasized that this eternal truth is nothing but the logical, or the historical process itself, he nevertheless finds himself compelled to supply this process with an end, just because he has to bring his system to a termination at some point or other. At the end of the whole philosophy, a return to the beginning is possible in only one way, namely by conceiving of the end of history as follows. Mankind arrives at the cognition of the selfsame absolute idea and declares that this cognition of the absolute idea is reached in Hegelian philosophy. In this way, however, the whole dogmatic content of the Hegelian system is declared to be absolute truth, in contradiction to his dialectical method, which dissolves all dogmatism. Thus, the revolutionary side is smothered beneath the overgrowth of the conservative side. From Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. Engels is here not condemning. Engels here is not condemning Hegel's system in favor of his method, but rather is condemning the eternal systematicity of that system. Hegel wanted philosophical truth, wanted to get at the eternal behind the historical once and for all. To this end, he derives the dialectic and the categories of his system. Indeed, Marx uses this very same dialectic and these self-same categories, for they are inextricably linked to each other. However, Marx sets Hegel's system in motion. He historicizes it, setting the totality and the system itself in motion. We will return to this topic in the final section. The historical circumstance which renders possible Marx's development of Hegel is, according to Marxism, the objective development of the production process. An incipient bourgeois society began to develop under feudalism as the historically appropriate social form to the development of international commerce and the increasing division of labor. This development of social forms occurred prior to the conscious apprehension of bourgeois society's own politically appropriate standpoint. As bourgeois society developed economically and socially, the awakened consciousness of the bourgeois did not point beyond its own internally necessary conditions of life, for it had not yet even realized its own full potential according to its own standards. But rather this consciousness demanded the assertion of itself politically over the shackles which the remnants of feudalism bound it with. As Abbé Sieyès, a revolutionary of the French bourgeois states in a revolutionary pamphlet, who was bold enough to maintain that the third estate does not contain within itself everything needful to constitute a complete nation. It is like a strong and robust man with one arm still in chains. From what is the third estate? In this way, the consciousness historically appropriate to the position of the bourgeois class was the mere interpretation of its own conditions of life, of understanding the importance of its own revolutionary position, through which it could develop its own freedom by merely asserting its own standpoint. On the other hand, as bourgeois society further developed economically, it found itself coming into crisis, the crisis of capital, or the emergence of capitalism from bourgeois society as its crisis. Increasingly, there became a separated stratum of working-class people who increasingly were unable to realize their freedom and bourgeois rights. As capital further structured social relations, all of society found itself increasingly alienated from the objective conditions through which society perpetuated itself. The subject was no longer at home with its object. In more theoretical terms, this is the loss of the object, which is supposed to be speculatively identical with the subject according to the bourgeois, that is the Hegelian standpoint. It is the estranging of one's own life activity and the product from one's own subjectivity, both in the loss of one's subjective agency and in no longer being freely at home with oneself, with one's object. Thus one is also estranged from one's own subjectivity and is at home in neither the subject nor the object. To put it another way, we are unfree. In practical terms, this appears as the product of production and one's own labor belonging to someone else, or to the seemingly inhuman production process itself. One does not find that they live on their own terms, but only at the behest of another. The social world is not produced by on one's own terms, but on the terms of a process which is not self-legislated. By society's own standard, it is unreasonable. The reasonability of the totality, or the self-legislation of society, is consequently sheared off from the reason of individuals. The universality of reason ceases to accord with the particular, but rather dominates it. Thus Marx inverts Hegel's claim about history being the self-development of freedom. Rather, history is the history of unfreedom, and that it appears as the domination of social classes over each other. As Marx says, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, from the Communist Manifesto. Of course, it is not just the self-identity or self-relation of subjectivity as the relation of universal reason to the particular that breaks down. But this, in fact, this is merely a projection of the breakdown of the unity of subject and object, and the subsequent domination of the object over the subject. To quote Marx, labor appears merely as a conscious organ scattered among the individual living workers at numerous points of the mechanical system. In machinery, objectified labor materially confronts living labor as a ruling power and as an active subsumption of the latter under itself, not only by appropriating it, but in the real production process itself. Thus capital, as the objectivity of the production process, comes to dominate labor as the subjectivity of individuals, in that it appears alienated from them. Furthermore, it comes to dominate the totality of production and the reproduction of the objectivity of society. The object as capital comes to dominate its own process of actualization. Finally, the object comes to destroy the appearance that the state holds the mantle of the subjectivity of society as a whole, by destroying the relation between universal and particular. Marx thus articulates the negative moment of the dialectic of bourgeois society. Bourgeois society fails to measure up to its own standards. All right, clarificational questions.
What are those standards?
We're unfree.
Oh.
We're unfree.
Oh, okay.
We are not at home with our object.
Only the object class has true freedom or more freedom, right?
They're unfree too. I mean, like to put it one way, like this is like there's a piece by Max Horkheimer called "The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom," and if you ask a capitalist, like, can you give me a job at your factory? And they'll say, well, I would, but the economy's bad right now. That's not freedom. They're subjected to the production process. Like, yeah. Sorry, we're out. We can't give you a job right now.
Yeah, because they could go bankrupt, or
yeah,
they can't make the things they want to make. They have to make the things that are marketable or profitable.
Yeah, the objective life of society dominates us. It's like it's not just like people at the top. It's like everyone is unfree. We are all dictated by the production process.
Yeah. So I understand how there is this reversal of subject and object in terms of like alienation and labor.
Sure.
I guess what I'm interested by is like wouldn't a lot of the other arguments, especially relating to freedom, also apply under feudalism? Like none of the subjects under feudalism would have like real agency or freedom in like a meaningful sense. They might not have been alienated from their labor, but like a peasant does not have like agency.
Wait, so what's the question?
I guess like
are you asking about Marx's argument or about Hegel's argument?
I'm asking about whose argument is this?
Right now we're talking about Marx's argument.
Right. Marx's argument, I suppose, is that hold on. Let me gather my thoughts on this. Sorry.
Yeah, sure.
There's so much of this.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry about this. I'm asking a lot of you. I know this.
Yeah, I guess part of what I would say to that is that feudalism lived up to its own standard, meaning the imminency of the unfreedom is that feudalism was exactly what it could be, meaning an agrarian society, literacy, poverty, disease, superstition, that represented the potential in feudal society. It only became a problem when there was a potential to move beyond it in bourgeois society, meaning when there was the growth of the printing press, the growth of the cities, the growth of a free laboring class that could take control of society. This is what Abbe says. That's when feudalism became a form of unfreedom. Right? And this is what Hegel would say, is that feudalism was rational in its heyday. It lived up to its own potential, right?
The one thing though is we wouldn't be as free under feudalism as bourgeois society, because under feudalism we're not self-conscious of our own freedom.
Exactly, yes, but we could only know that after the fact.
That's why the dialectic. That's what the development of the dialectic is. It's driven by necessity. What's that necessity? It's freedom.
Like the feudal order, we were born into a hierarchy that was like we had no agency over changing that. Like you were just born into a family that was of a certain status. Labor was supposed to make us free in bourgeois society, and that we could kind of work up this ladder, right? And then that kind of the alienation is that turn between labor kind of being our means of making ourselves free, like making something of ourselves in a way that we couldn't in the feudal order, but then we became alienated, and instead of production serving man now serves production for production's sake, sort of.
The necessity of feudalism was survival, because because you said the necessity of bourgeois society was freedom, that people wanted to be more free, but feudalism came from the downfall of the Roman Republic. So
Well,
so conditions were very rough and very took it back 1,000 years.
Yeah, and you get different explanations between Hegel and Marx why feudalism was necessary at its time. For Marx, it's going to be because the form of production necessitates it. For Hegel, it's going to be more. I haven't actually read Hegel's whole philosophy of history, but it's probably going to be something more abstract relating to the speculative moment in Marx. Hegel, as positing the highest level of bourgeois consciousness, thus falls flat on his face if he is taken ahistorically. Indeed, Hegel has generally fallen by the wayside as far as philosophy goes. This is the negative moment of the object, as it is taken against bourgeois subjectivity. In other words, the objective life of society in the production process, once speculatively identical with its self-consciousness in Hegel, comes to outstrip and negate Hegel's philosophy. Taken at face value, the history of the world does not appear as the history of the self-consciousness of mankind. The subject does not appear at home with its object, but rather we appear merely unfree, and the slaughter bench of history that Hegel depicts as the stage on which reason plays its ruse is merely a slaughter bench. All of this is essentially the claim that everything that exists no longer appears as necessarily governed by the concept. Reality appears not as a self-mediating totality, but as fractured into pieces that fall away from each other. On the other hand, the non-identity of subject and object is negated by the fact that capitalism, as the crisis of bourgeois society, indeed bourgeois society itself, requires a certain articulation of bourgeois right as a necessity. Indeed, capital requires an equivalence of individuals as bourgeois subjects for exchange to function rationally. Accordingly, individuals must have the freedom to dictate their lives socially and productively to a certain extent. This indicates the fact that we can be conscious of this absence of the identity of subject and object via a certain absence of bourgeois right, which itself indicates a potential. The Hegelian idea of the idea that does not come to itself through conscious development, but through the unconsciousness of actors, is insufficient for the further development of a society that is conceptually governed. The consciousness of absence, however, is itself a consciousness of society, and that it grasps what society believes it could be, but has not yet achieved in full actuality. As Marx says, it will then become plain that the world has long since dreamed of something which it needs only to become conscious of for it to possess in reality. It will then become plain that our task is not to draw a sharp mental line between past and future, but to complete the thought of the past. Lastly, it will become plain that mankind will not begin any new work, but will consciously bring about the completion of its old work. From a letter from Marx to Arnold Ruge. Through the critique of the left, Marx aims to grasp the inner necessity in the consciousness of this absence. For what is the left but the highest consciousness of the possibility inherent in society? Thus, according to its own standard, society, with the left, consciously demands that it should be conceptually governed, that it should be self-mediating and grasp itself as a living organism would, as an organic totality. In fact, this not only manifests as a conscious demand for society to go beyond itself by realizing its inner possibility, but indeed Marx shows that society necessarily constantly revolutionizes its own conditions of production by its own standards. Thus, the question becomes one of the conscious apprehension of this course of development and society being able to politically grasp its own movement, or the lack thereof. To quote Rosa Luxemburg, bourgeois society stands at the crossroads, either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism, from the Junius pamphlet. This is not a mechanical determinism, but a standard that Luxemburg is articulating as emerging from bourgeois society itself. There is a choice to be made by society, and that choice is either a qualitative shift or one that falls below its own standards. The commonly accepted course of history up until now shows us what the latter option has looked like. What then is the nature of this qualitative change that is rendered necessary? Any demand for freedom in society ultimately encounters the problematic that Hegel, as the pinnacle of bourgeois consciousness, sets for any society that would be free. This is the problem of self-mediation. For to be free is to be a subject that is at home with its object, that is identical with it, that is self-mediating through its own object. But as Hegel states, a subject is only a subject insofar as it is free. A subject is only a subject if it knows its object, and it only knows its object if it is speculatively identical with it. Thus the problem is not that the subject and the object already exist and must be made one. Rather, the subject of society that objectifies the world as its own object must be constituted. This, however, is a task that lies beyond the scope of philosophy. As Max Horkheimer states, insight is not enough, of course, to change the state of affairs. For the error is not that people do not recognize the subject, but that the subject does not exist. Everything, therefore, depends on creating the free subject that consciously shapes social life. And this subject is none other than the rationally organized socialist society, which regulates its own existence. From Dawn and Decline, The Little Man and the Philosophy of Freedom. This solution can arise out of none other than the history of the demand for bourgeois right itself. It cannot be a transcendent design for bourgeois society, but one that emerges from within it. To constitute freedom in reality would mean that the presently communally unconscious behavior of conducting social life would no longer appear to be the behavior of an external objectivity that imposes itself on humanity, but rather the world as an object would be the self-objectification or self-production of a conscious and hence self-conscious subject. Society would consciously produce its conditions of life, and thus it would be at home in its own self-production. Okay, second to last section. Questions before I explain this diagram? Okay, so basically we've got the dialectic between bourgeois society and capitalism. Capitalism is not the same as bourgeois society. It is the crisis that emerges out of bourgeois society. Initially, bourgeois society is truly free. It is, but as production continues to develop, capitalism emerges as its crisis. These two things point beyond so we have basically capital, the crisis of capital, constantly running into bourgeois society. It's the overturning back and forth. But these two things, the fact that there is a crisis, that there's both the crisis of production, but also this need for the articulation of bourgeois right, points beyond something. What is that something? It's the negation of private property, which is what communism is in an abstract sense. The conscious reflex of this is the dialectic between Hegelianism and Marxism as its crisis. Hegelianism, this huge system, in the decades following it, just completely disintegrates. Like, Hegelianism is huge, and then it's suddenly nothing, and like the history of philosophy, if you look at it, people will talk about Hegelianism and give it like one chapter, or like even like one paragraph. They just don't talk about it. Why? Because Hegelianism ran into this crisis, the crisis of capitalism. Marxism is the articulation of the crisis of Hegelianism. What does this crisis do? It points beyond itself to something possible. That possibility is the horizon of political possibility. It's as far as we can see from our present standpoint. It's a horizon in the sense that we can't see beyond it, but this crisis points beyond that horizon. All right. Questions? No? Yeah?
The kind of farthest horizon that we can perceive at this moment, and that theoretically, where that achieved, it wouldn't necessarily be the end of history, but there would be a new thing to articulate or a new horizon emerges.
Yeah. I mean, the idea is that it would be the end of prehistory, not the end of history, and the beginning of the free development of society. the development of society according to its own standards, freely.
Okay. So self-consciousness of humankind, would that be like, because it's like the history of like freedom, right? That's what Hegel is saying, kind of.
The history of humankind.
Yeah, like that's his.
Hegel is saying that the history is history is the development. It's the development of freedom in history. Is what history.
Yeah. Well, would that be like like the development? What does it say? It's taken at face value. The history of the world does not appear as the history of the self-consciousness of humankind. So the self-consciousness of humankind, like freedom.
It's the consciousness that we are free as subjects.
Oh, okay.
That we are reasonable, and because through our reason we are free. No. Let's say you first.
I just have a comment maybe that we're aiming at self-consciousness that we are free, and what that means for Marx is self-consciousness that capitalism is a product of our freedom. It's a product of our own activity. So this gets into the concept of alienation, which is that it appears as if society is this alien force that's dominating us, but actually it's a product of the workers' own activity. It's a product of their own labor, which is producing this thing that's appearing like an alien force that's dominating. So part of what you could say is that it's a self-consciousness of our responsibility, meaning we create our own society, we create all the forces that dominate us. And if we take responsibility for it, if we become conscious of the fact that it's a product of our own activity, we can transform it. Because it's not a natural necessity, it's a product of human freedom. So capitalism is a freedom problem. And the idea is to become self-conscious of that, but also to constitute a subject. And that would be, as Horkheimer says, the socialist society.
Yeah.
Right.
Beyond the dialectic. We have seen how raising society to Hegel's standard is merely raising society to its own standard. And so society and Hegelianism dialectically point beyond present reality, present social reality. I have said much on Hegelian and Marxist dialectics. A few words on the distinction between the two. There is the obvious difference that the Hegelian dialectic applies to the ideal, within which the material is contained as a moment of totality, whereas the Marxist dialectic considers the material and ideal as non-identical moments of a dialectic of social practice. However, this may seem to reconstitute the Kantian problematic of the dualism of ontology between appearances lodged within consciousness and a world of things in themselves opposed to consciousness. It nevertheless does so at a historically higher level. This is because for Marx, history constitutes itself not as a problem of merely understanding the world through philosophy, a la German Idealism, but as a problem for historical theory and practice. Thus, Marx cannot get by with a mere grasping of things as they already are, but must engage with a society alienated from itself as the problematic of the relation between the ideal and the real. Thus, we come across the second primary difference between the Marxist and Hegelian dialectics, namely that Marx does not have a totality waiting for him to take up at the end of history, but must grasp the totality as itself a historical appearance. Indeed, Lukács puts it as follows. It is even more difficult to establish fixed meanings for concepts in Marx's improved version of the dialectic than in the Hegelian original. For if concepts are only the intellectual forms of historical realities, then these forms, one-sided and abstract and false as they are, belong to the true unity as genuine aspects of it. Hegel's statements about this problem of terminology in the preface to the Phenomenology are thus even more true than Hegel himself realized when he said, just as the expressions unity of subject and object, of finite and infinite, of being and thought, etc., have the drawback that object and subject bear the same meaning as when they exist outside that unity, so that within the unity they mean something other than is implied by their expression. So too, falsehood is not, qua false, any longer a moment of truth. In the pure historicization of the dialectic, this statement receives yet another twist. Insofar as the false is an aspect of the true, it is both false and non-false. From history and class consciousness. There are multiple things going on in this quote. Firstly, Hegel notes that a concept means something quite different when taken as subsisting on its own, or as false, than when taken as part of the greater totality, or as true. So too, falsehood is not, qua false, any longer a moment of truth. Secondly, Lukács notes that all our concepts are themselves false because they are merely the conscious reflex of historical realities. Thus, insofar as the totality available to us is merely an appearance and not yet actual, it itself is false. The concepts taken as part of the true are thus non-false. Yes, in that they are really aspects of this totality, and false insofar as this totality is itself false. Accordingly, the conceptual remains necessary to grasp reality as a totality, and yet insufficient insofar as reality lies beyond mere conscious thought. To understand the present moment demands this dual character of the necessity of understanding and the impossibility of doing so as long as it lies beyond conscious activity. As Marx says, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, from his theses on Feuerbach. To change it requires grasping it, and grasping it is simultaneously possible only insofar as it is consciously changeable. This is rendered even more troublesome in a world in which theory and practice, as modes of consciousness of social reality, have fallen out of relation to each other and to society. But that goes beyond the scope of this talk. For further reference on this topic, see the essay titled On the Concept of History by Walter Benjamin in the final 2 weeks of the Platypus main reading group syllabus, along with an attempt to brush the history of the left in the 20th century against the grain, as Benjamin puts it. As a final note, the historicization of the dialectic unmasks the dialectic itself as a transient form. Under all hitherto existing history, objectivity and subjectivity have necessarily been interrelated. As Marx says, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past, from the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. In other words, the potentialities available to the subject are given in advance by the objective development of society, and the objective development of society is conditioned by the subjective consciousness of it. Should material production become unshackled from the fetters that capital sets for it, the subject would come to be less and less restricted by the limitations of the object, i.e., the material conditions would constantly transcend their own limits. Similarly, the individual would come to be free from the imposition of the totality upon them. Quote Marx, "In the place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all," from the Communist Manifesto. But this is to overcome the necessary speculative interrelationship between the universal in society and the particular individual, the relationship between the subject, object, and totality, the demand of methodology for systematicity and systematicity for methodology. We have seen, however, that this is precisely what constitutes the essence of the dialectic. As Adorno says, in the face of utopia's concrete possibility, dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. A right state of things would be set free from dialectics, neither system nor contradiction, from negative dialectics. All right. Are there any clarificational questions on that section?
You had one earlier about Jordan's quote.
Utopia is the first time that this comes up in your whole teaching, the utopia,
Yeah.
in regards to Adorno. But I didn't hear you say anything about, whether or not this relates to Hegel, like the concept of utopia.
No, utopia is not a concept in Hegel, as far as I'm aware. This is a category we deal with on the syllabus, but like Adorno, by utopia, Adorno understands something that negates the present state of things, something that goes beyond what things are, something that's perhaps isn't even graspable at present. I mean, and the word utopia, it comes from the word, it literally means no place, in the sense that it is no place. Okay. No clarificational questions? All right, we'll get on to the Q&A. Okay.
There were a number of questions from Mohammed.
Yeah, Mohammed, why don't we come? I remember Mohammed and Gabe both had questions, so Mohammed, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll ask my question from earlier, which is, what's it called? How is it so that Hegel had the confidence in his own time to say that he had reached the end of history, but I guess how was that kind of outstripped, with the development of history?
Right. So no, we've got a mic over here, Kristen. So the reason what Hegel means by the end of history is that we have achieved self-consciousness of our own freedom. And so basically Hegel is saying that in and through bourgeois society, we have realized that we are free individuals. I mean, he has this quote that's something like, the Orientals thought one is free, the Greeks thought some are free, and we know that everyone is free. And that's the sense in which Hegel says that we have reached the end of history. It's because we are self-conscious of our own freedom. And then what was the other part of your question?
So then the other question I asked later on was in regards to what's it called? In regards to the dialectic, I guess I was trying to think of the clarification, or trying to get a clarification of what Engels was talking about when he was talking about the revolutionary aspect of the dialectic. Just because I recall that Adorno talks about the static side of dialectic, and I guess the question that I had was, it seemed to me when you were talking about that teaching, Engels was talking about how the revolutionary side of the dialectic seems to be something that Hegel neglects. But what I think is interesting is that Adorno himself notes how the static side of dialectic gets neglected. So I guess I was trying to ask, like, what kind of historical change had happened between Engels and Adorno that led both of them to emphasize the two different aspects of dialectic?
So they are talking about something slightly different, because the static side, the conservative side for Engels is the systematicity of the dialectic, whereas Adorno is talking about the static side of the dialectic as method itself, which is Engels is concerning himself with the dialectic as revolutionary as method. But yeah, so did that answer your question, or is there? Do you want to?
No. I'll come back to that question later because I'll have to think about it a little bit more.
Okay, Gabe and then Ben.
Okay. Trying to remember my question from earlier. Oh yeah, it was about so naive consciousness.
Yeah. So, and
this goes back a little, gets us back a little bit earlier in the presentation. But what Hegel is taking as naive consciousness, right? And he's proceeding from that into right. So is that naive consciousness like is that taken to be human naive consciousness in general, meaning ahistorically, or the naive consciousness of the bourgeois subject? Something of what Kant says about reading Rousseau, where he's like, Rousseau taught me that the task of the philosopher is not to get at some higher truth, but just to explain what the common day laborer already knows. So is that what Hegel is taking as naive consciousness? Is it itself a historical product of the naive consciousness of the bourgeois subject?
So this would be better posed to someone who's read the whole phenomenology, but from what I can say, I mean, like, does anyone remember what the first step of the phenomenology was? Sense certainty, right? So it goes. I mean, this seems like more a modern problematic than a one that could be localized to the beginning of Western philosophy.
Yeah, what I would say about it is that he's looking at naive, like I think the notion of naive consciousness is just consciousness in its immediacy that hasn't been thought over, and he's looking at that as that has developed throughout all of history.
Yeah.
So he's not necessarily looking at it just from the standpoint of the bourgeois subject.
Do we want to move the mic back?
But the thing is,
yeah, he's not looking at it just wholly from the standpoint of the bourgeois subject, but the thing that's kind of revealed is that reason's already at play from the very first step at the beginning of human history.
I mean, but certainly we couldn't have this sort of like the fact that we can have this sort of dialectical development in the sense that Hegel has it is modern. I mean, like you couldn't say back then, like, well, consciousness has these stages that it needs to go through to reach this ultimate stage. It's like, no, that's I mean, it's
yeah, I think but I feel like what your question is getting at is also the idea of bourgeois common sense,
Right. Yeah.
and the within the notion of bourgeois common sense is the idea that if common sense stays with itself at its own level, it violates itself. So the aim would be there is a certain sense in Hegel where I think he's taking up the Rousseauian project of making explicit the kind of structure.
Thinking over common sense.
Yes. Yeah. So there is already like but that's kind of how it starts with naive consciousness. But the thing is that common sense is something that would be variable at different times historically.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the only thing I was. What Hegel takes as naive consciousness is itself. He's recognizing it as a historical product.
sure.
Yeah, I mean the opening of the logic mirrors the opening and the development of philosophy itself. I mean there is kind of this like Parmenian meditation that's happening, and he's seeing it as both a logical and historical.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
We've got someone who raised their hand,
Oh,
but
okay.
we'll come back to you, Delaney.
Let's go to
Ben.
Hi, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can.
So I guess I'm going to get a little meta about this question. So historically in Platypus, the function of a teach-in is very flexible, and oftentimes they serve as internal education. Yeah, as in that there seems to be some kind of deficit in the baseline pedagogy that the membership receives around X, Y, Z topic, which might be relevant for interacting with the left. And so my question for you is, what do you feel is the occasion for this teach-in? Who is this towards? What did you feel needed to be rectified? That sort of thing.
Right. So one thing that's come up a lot is in talking to both Platypus members and contacts has been that I guess they want to understand the sort of philosophical moment that Platypus deals with better, and specifically the dialectic. So there's that feature, which is that like there's some addressal of like sort of the German idealist dialectical side, the philosophical side of Platypus's pedagogy in the main reading syllabus, but it isn't like there is things left out, and people have come up to me and been like I'm confused about this. Can you help explain this to me more? And I'm like, well, maybe I should do a teaching on this. And then the other thing is like I'm trying to remember what I said previously, but I feel like this has also been an attempt to consolidate. Like my history with Platypus was that I used to be a member and then I left for a few years and then I came back. And this is an attempt on my part to consolidate what I feel like I have gained through that, and what was basically, I mean, it's just trying to recreate my own education in a condensed form for other people. Insofar as I feel like, I mean, that's sort of what teachings are in general, though, I feel. So, yeah. I mean, but I mean, the main thing was that people have come up to me confused. And I also noticed that, like, I felt like I've been able to better contribute to discussions on various issues by having some grasp of Hegel. And so I wondered if that could be useful to other people.
if I can ask a follow-up to that, just
Yeah,
to
sure.
finish the question. So, how do I phrase this? Sometimes a topic will like pop out that it feels like something needs to be addressed. And oftentimes something can be important and yet doesn't feel like it pops out. I could give a teach-in, for example, on the, you know, left of the 1940s, but that would seem maybe esoteric, even if it were interesting or relevant. And so
Sure.
what I wonder is, what sort of why do people care about Hegel right now? So on the one hand, it's the teaching is
Yeah.
motivated by people being interested in Hegel. Why are people interested in Hegel? If you can hazard a guess to that, maybe
Well,
as like supplement to Marx, if that makes sense. Like as though there's something like deficient about the way that it might be taken up in Platypus, but also more broadly, right? So the obvious example, maybe a bit of a low blow, but like the Hegelian e-girls in New York, that there
right.
seems to be this like cultural phenomenon of Hegelianism. I don't want to ramble, but I guess the point of my question being like, if we're talking about how the dialectic becomes material, what are the material conditions for the conversation about Hegel?
Right. Well, so one thing that I've noticed, and this is something we're trying. So this summer we're actually doing both the Hegel and negative dialectics summer reading groups. So we are sort of one thing that I could point to is the attempt to adjudicate the philosophy debate within Platypus, and then the question is, okay, what's the cause of that? And that's one thing that I want to know more about. But also, it feels like um, maybe let me think for a second. Yeah. Do you have the mic? Yeah. Okay.
Is, at least for Marxism, the self-conscious expression on a philosophical level of bourgeois society.
Yeah, but why right now?
I think that it. I mean, we live in a very. I mean, why right now specifically?
Yeah.
I know that internal to the chapter, the philosophy dispute is a big issue, but I feel like broader in regards to contacts and other people, I think that it's a response to kind of the illiberalism of the present. You know, I mean, there's a reason that the reading group pedagogy has shifted over the years to focus on radical bourgeois philosophy. You know, as the kind of preceding moments in the Marx's bookshelf. You know, um, I think that it's a continuation of that, a reaction against that prompts people to be interested in it. I also am somewhat suspicious, and this gets into the philosophy dispute kind of like uh, area, that people are animated and drawn to philosophical issues at times of crisis, because philosophy at least is supposed to offer some sort of resolution or solution to that. And I feel like that there is a knee-jerk reaction into philosophy at times when politics is becoming more prevalent in society as a whole. You know, because philosophy can be kind of a safe haven from the political impulse, the messiness of the political. And I mean that's one of, I feel like, the things that was kind of prevalent within the philosophy dispute itself. Of, if there is, you know, because in how I took your talk to get at Evie, was this idea that politics is kind of separate from philosophy. That although there is this interesting connection between Hegel and Marx, the political constitutes a different domain or a different mode of addressing these problems that isn't reducible to some sort of philosophical foundation. I took that to be one of the points that you make in your talk. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
I would say that at least they're not they're related, but they're not identical with each other. And this isn't. I don't know if this is the dialectical non-identity. Non-identity. I think this is more just like politics. I mean, Marxism has a deep relationship to philosophy, but it attempts a different mode of dealing with reality, a different practical mode, at the very least. Yeah.
I mean, can you say more about that relationship between? I mean, I don't want to gloss over that.
Yeah. Can we come back to this in a minute? Yeah. I guess like the thing that I would think of. I mean,
Maybe just to lubricate the conversation a little bit. So you're saying that people are coming to you talking about Hegel, asking like, what's going on with this? It seems as though it's this missing piece. Is there like a particular context that they're talking about this? What are the kind of interests that these people have otherwise? Maybe to expand the question a little bit, why might the left be taking up Hegel and philosophy? I think you're on the right track when you mention how philosophy seems to become the kind of like parking lot for just maybe those are just some threads to follow on if you're thinking about how to answer the question.
Yeah, so the people I'm thinking of, I'm going to name you all by name, but there's me. Seth, I know, is interested in Hegel. One of them is in this call right now, Sam Johnson. Talked to me about doing it, about how he was actually preparing a talk on dialectics. And then June has also shown interest to me. And then, did I say Gabe? Yeah, but you've expressed interest in Hegel. So,
And I just a lack of understanding of dialectics, not just Hegel, but like all the way to Adorno, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, if I didn't tell you, I mean, ever since I started on platypus, I feel that so much of it is supposed to be dialectics. And I don't know, I feel that it's necessity, the necessity of this teaching to me at least feels very obvious in that sense. But yeah, I mean.
Wait. In what sense?
In the sense that a lot of platypus is sort of reason of being dialectic.
Yeah, but why does it appear that way? I mean, like, I think that to me, like, at least to, so like, to talk about like my own sort of interest, I guess like, I just, for me, there's always been a compulsion to sort of make sense of the world, and like, Marxism, at least in Marxism, I like the more I engage with platypus, the less sense the world seemed to make. Or maybe it's the less sense that Marxism, I mean, like, perhaps neither the world nor Marxism makes sense at the present. And it's like, there's desire, maybe like my impulse was to go back, to see when things did make sense. I mean, I don't know if Gabe or June, you want to speak on your interest with Hegel.
Well, my interest in Hegel, I wanted to. June, you go first. Oh, okay. I wanted to just say about the left specifically. So, I wanted to mention this in case people on the call didn't hear it, but we had new people show up, SDS people, right? And so it's like, oh, you're from SDS. Why did you come? And they're like, well, SDS told me to come. And so I was like, and so I guess I'm thinking like, why did SDS? Because SDS knows about us. Why did they say come to this specifically? And I feel like they, because it's partly because these left orgs, like they're not teaching this stuff on this level.
Yeah.
There is a, like, I guess Ben, you're asking about the need. I don't know so much about that, but that there is a felt need on the left. There is perhaps an interest in this, and the existing left orgs are just not on an educational level are just not able to reproduce like this kind of pedagogy.
Yeah, but that's like sort of the presupposition of platypus, though, right? Is that the left isn't able to educate its own members.
Well, but with Hegel too, like in other words, they might think that they can with Marx, right? But they really don't think they can with Hegel.
Yeah, but why do they find Hegel necessary?
Right.
I mean, exactly, like my thought is that like maybe social reality makes particularly little sense right now.
Yeah, because of the political crisis.
I would also, I mean, I think that that's taking a charitable approach to assume that they're coming to be educated, but I know that there is also sentiment in the left that platypus is detached from kind of current events. We don't have a positive political movement, and that we kind of get lost in the weeds of, ideas, and we do a lot of reading and stuff. So I guess there's a suspicious part of me that thinks, is it really they're coming to be educated about Hegel, or is it let's go show them just how abstract and esoteric platypus can get? So that's just a suspicion of mine.
Perhaps, but they seem pretty interested, at least.
There was a little side comment that they made to each other
that I overheard about like this will make me understand Mao better.
Did they say that?
Yes, they said that.
Well, that's showing interest.
Yes.
So
Mao has on contradiction.
No, yeah, and that's one of the things is that especially within the Austin left, on contradiction was used as like a Bible by the Maoists as detailing, here's your worldview, here's how you look at things.
Yeah, I mean,
so there's been within the context of the Austin left and like the prevalence of the Maoism here, a precedent in the sense of like an interest in dialectics, and philosophy as this problem, at least. Like I remember arguing with the Maoists, like the Red Guards years ago, about postmodernism because they saw postmodernism as a huge problem and symptom on the left that prevented it from engaging in genuine kind of politics. And their solution to postmodernism was dialectics.
Yeah. When was this? Circa when?
This was circa. This is like a while ago, Amelie. This is like 2019.
2019, yeah. And I came to Platypus 2021 to 2022. So this could, I mean, and that's when I left also. So this may be something, I mean, this may just be reflecting a continuing lack of sense of reality that's like becoming ever more present with, I don't know. I mean, like maybe the death of the millennial left is what some people would say, but I don't know. Things just don't make sense in a lot of ways.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think maybe to answer Ben's first question directly around the why, like what moment arises this. I think for me, there's kind of like the platypus reason, and there's the sort of broader social context, which is that I guess use the terms that Evie laid out, right? That platypus's standard of understanding its own pedagogy is dialectical. It is considered essential and is emphasized pretty consistently, that it's spoken about and taught. And yet the way in which someone goes about sort of grasping something dialectically seems to be through like osmosis or intuition, right? Rather than attacking the subject head on. And to be perfectly honest, I don't really give a shit about Hegel qua Hegel. I give a shit about Hegel as because of his relationship to dialectics. And whether that's a productive or a non-productive relationship is kind of the question. But you go ahead. Sorry.
But and I've heard this in pedagogues calls. People will say like, you don't like one of the reasons why you can skip the Lukács is because Trotsky makes the point of dialectics better. I mean, Trotsky's like you can learn how to do how to understand dialectics from Trotsky, and it's like Well, okay, why don't people agree with that?
Yeah, and so I guess it's like, and that's kind of the tension I'm saying is that maybe it's a subjective limitation of my own that I cannot understand it via Trotsky, but I haven't been able to, and so
Right.
I feel like there's something more to grasp. And then the broader social point is that I just think post neoliberalism in general is a disorienting experience for all of the left, including Platypus. And so there is that tendency to want to, find some means by which to reorient yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I have a
If
specific
I might
question.
be, wait, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Maybe I'm being a little of a hard ass when I raise this, but so Sam, you say that what it's not about like Hegel per se, but it's that the Platypus pedagogy seems to be really about elevating the primacy of the dialectic in political thinking, and that Hegel seems to be a way to open that up. And
Yes.
so maybe just to reiterate my second question, which admittedly you said you weren't answering, right? This past year I gave a teach-in on Adorno, who in a certain sense people are actually also turning to increasingly, I've seen, but I think less than the like surprising like Hegel fad. And so the question still stands, which is like, why do people feel the need to get to dialectics through Hegel? I'm raising my eyebrows even though my camera's off. Like I don't think this is a question that's going to be answered in this conversation, but it feels like the question, you know? Yeah.
I mean, I would say like that when I first started looking into like trying to understand the dialectic, right? Like Lenin has this line where he says that it for in order to understand the first chapter of Capital, you need to understand all of Hegel, right? And that's not an uncommon kind of statement throughout the Marxism. So it's very quick where you're engaging with, with looking around in Marxism and finding out that, oh, guy, this Hegel guy is pretty essential, right, to grasping what,
Yeah, but there's the question: why can't you just like go read a textbook on dialectics or something? Like, why can't you go read Adorno's Intro to Dialectics? Like that's maybe a more easily understood Intro to Dialectics.
Okay.
And so like for me, the compulsion is like to go back to make sense of things by understanding their history. That's at least why I went to Hegel and not like I tried that and tried reading Adorno's Intro to Dialectics, and I started getting going, and I don't remember why I stopped, but it just, I don't know, it didn't grab me in the same way that Hegel did, because it didn't feel as like, yeah.
I promise that this will be my final comment, and
Sure.
I'll be the devil's advocate here. So the split between left and right Hegelianism is really the question of whether or not Hegel as a system is a matter of sort of like formula or critique. That the right Hegelians take up Hegel as like formalized system, and the Marxists take up Hegel as like method, which Lukács says straightforwardly. And so my immediate impulse is that when one is inclined to turn to Hegel when dissatisfied with Marx, that the easiest explanation when thinking about these historical groupings is that that points to dissatisfaction with like dialectic as method or something, that it's about like schematizing consciousness instead, that like the question becomes like how can we sort of positively take up dialectics rather than negatively take up dialectics. I don't mean to sort of identify that or rather lay that upon any particular person. I think it's fine to be interested in Hegel, but just that like trying to think about this as a more a phenomenon of our moment, so to speak, right? You mentioned the SDS people in the room. Unfortunately, I joined a little late, so I didn't know who was in the audience. But when they say like maybe this will help me understand Mao better, right? If anyone was here at the 2023 convention, the Whither Maoism panel, right? The young Maoist on the panel is like I'm a Maoist because like I know that there's an objective reality and like practice is how I come to know it. Like it's very much about like knowledge rather than politics in a lot of ways that people want to know things. Um, I'm really not converging on like a dynamic conclusion, or not dynamic, like a just like a. I'm not like giving you something. It's very amorphous, but my sense is that one has to take seriously the dissatisfaction with Marx, which is a component of the turn to Hegel, and that we should be taking that seriously. That's the last thing I say. I'll promise.
Sorry. Well, I was gonna say, if I might make a comment, I wonder if it's in some sense kind of a retreat from politics that's going on right now, in the sense that in some sense the interest in Adorno or Hegel or even more of the kind of like bourgeois thinkers rather than like like kind of this retreat from the question of like Lenin or Trotsky or Trotskyism or of the whole second international is kind of this is coming out of this kind of disillusionment with the millennial left and kind of a retreat from the party question into this more I don't know, this more philosophical malaise after the whole disintegration of the millennial left. I don't know, just a comment that came into my mind.
I mean, like, I think I can try and make what I was saying more explicit. I very explicitly like wanted to go back to when it seemed to make sense, which was prior to Marx, right? Because with Marx, the world stops making sense as a coherent whole. The totality becomes false in a certain sense. And so it's like, yeah, it is a retreat from politics. And so like that was my initial like response. And I mean, like the hope now is that now that I've satisfied my impulse, I can I mean, like I just for the record, I argued for the Trotskyism reading group for the summer reading group. I argued for the Trotskyism. That's what I'm gonna say. But like I don't know. Yeah, I mean I think.
And that's another good reason for us to do the summer reading groups on the philosophy dispute around that dispute, because the fundamental issue with that is the nature of politics, and hopefully it will disabuse people of this anti-political impulse. I don't know.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll see.
Yeah, well, then that's the question of is it about? I guess. Well, I think this is another thing that's not mentioned here. Like the interest in the chapter about doing the Hegel is that Hegel that a better understanding of dialectics will help us understand platypus better. So it's part of it is, I don't want to say an anxiety, but maybe no, I'll say anxiety. An anxiety about reproducing platypus activity, and do we really understand how to do that, and what we're doing, and what other avenues are opened up by this historical moment right now, because we are in a point of historical transition, and as has been emphasized, I think, in internal discussions, what does it mean to reproduce platypus activity? And I think that a better understanding of dialectics is part of the idea is that might help us do that.
Yeah, I mean, my question, during this teaching, one of the questions that came up for me is, what is platypus for? Just outright, what is platypus for? Yeah.
Well, I also wanted to say that I think the interest in the Hegel and the negative dialectic student group isn't just to understand dialectics as like a method that we have ready access to, but also to understand potentially what is one of the high points of crisis within platypus. I think the philosophy dispute in a certain sense is one of the higher expressions of a crisis within platypus, and it's also, in my opinion, one of the more interesting ones because it was disciplined and culminated in actual pedagogy, as opposed to say some of the crises that surrounded the philosophy dispute that coincided with them, like the right wing debate, the crisis in Richard's membership, and a lot of the
other members too.
Yeah, what have you. So I feel like, yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
Well, finish your comment, Steph, before. Yeah, I don't want to butt in.
Yeah, well, I feel like there is a general feeling in the Austin chapter of disorientation, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to speak for all of y'all, but of disorientation and kind of alienation from the group at large that we've been trying to work through for about a year, 2 years now. And the hope, I think, in a certain sense, is by understanding how, you know, Platypus itself managed itself through a kind of pedagogical crisis. We could also use it to cope with our own, not in the sense of like retrieving some sort of dialectical insight or what have you, but in the actual sense of like understanding how things are disciplined on an organizational level and what culminated from it.
I think you're overprojecting your own point of view onto other people.
I could be. I mean,
I talked to Gabe. I asked Gabe why he wanted to do the Hegel, and he's just said like, yeah, I'm interested in the Hegel. I want to do the Hegel.
Yeah.
I mean that's
partly because you guys talk about it so much, and I felt like I need to be.
Yeah.
I think it's important. Yeah, go ahead, Mohammed.
The question that I want to ask, and when I ask this question, I don't mean to make it sound accusatory at all, but I guess I might frame it that way or whatnot, which is kind of, I guess kind of why the navel gazing, in the sense that like, what's going on in the, because I don't suspect that, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't suspect in the Austin left there are discussions regarding Hegel. I imagine that this is a question regarding Platypus rather than a question regarding the left in Austin.
Yeah, there is I don't know what I like.
Ben, do you mind if you clarify what do you mean by like it's Malou? Like, are you talking about like the platypus Malou or kind of the like the Malou in Austin?
No, I mean the platypus milieu. Like Hegel is obviously people are coming to Platypus to learn about Hegel, and so there are people with these questions who aren't already members, but that they want to come to us might actually differentiate them from the left.
I mean,
not as
I think,
just like a basic given, but just like a fact of the present circumstance.
I mean, to me, it sort of sounds like the desire to, at least within Platypus, the desire to understand Hegel and the desire to understand Platypus are related.
Do you want to expand upon that, Evie?
Well, I mean, like I said earlier that like the question, what is Platypus for, came up while I was trying to do this teach-in. It was like, because like, I mean, this teach-in was part of the reason why I went to go study Hegel was to understand Platypus better. I mean, that was the whole original reason.
Well, not to play devil's advocate, Evie, but like, forgive me for pointing this out, but like, in any sort of teaching that anyone does, I guess the question of, well, what is Platypus doing is raised. I mean, I recall back in February,
like, no, but like I'm making this point that like I've talked to several members, and me going off, being a member, going off to do my own thing, and then becoming a member again, is a semi-unusual case. Like the whole intention was from the start was not to do a teach-in. The whole intention was to understand Platypus and then understand if I wanted to come back. That was the whole reason.
All right. Sorry, I guess I was gonna make a different point, because I guess when you were making the point of like, oh, by doing this teach-in, I raised the question of what is Platypus doing. I guess kind of a response I was gonna have with that is, well, I think with any teach-in anyone's doing with regards to Platypus, so people are asking, well, what is Platypus doing? I mean, I still recall back in San Antonio when we had the Bukharin teach-in back in February. I recall Crichton on call asked me like, hey, well, why doesn't Platypus read Bukharin? And I gave him a response there. But I mean, even with like little activities like that, where it, oh, sorry, where you
but like Seth wants to look into the philosophy, to read Hegel, to look into the philosophy dispute. Sam wanted to look into dialectics because he wanted to understand Platypus better. I looked into dialectics because I wanted to understand Platypus better. There's a common thread with the members here of Platypus who are interested in Hegel.
Allow me to intervene here if I can.
Sure.
I think the missing layer to this conversation is the formal avenues that these are taken up in. And so the point is that nothing is, assuming that you're a member with access to the list, for example, and I don't want to turn this into a logistical discussion. You can read the threads. You don't need to formalize a reading group around it, nor do you necessarily need to provide an internal education on Hegel via a teach-in. Not saying you shouldn't, but that one needs to think seriously about the functions of these different apparatuses within platypus and why one might pursue one rather than another. So when Mohammed is asking, like, well, everyone asks, what is platypus doing in the process of a teach-in? It's because they're learning something new and asking about whether it matters with respect to the platypus project. And yet, at the same time, that learning doesn't necessarily need to culminate in a teach-in. That there's a judgment being made about in what way is this important? Why does it matter? And so I'll even just loop back to my original questions, which were like, why Hegel and who's interested in it? The reason I'm asking it is because that I think is exactly the takeaway that should not necessarily be the takeaway of the teach-in, but of like maybe you, Evie, specifically, the process of like getting here.
Sure. Yeah.
And so the question is not just like, why did you do this? It's why did you do it this way, which I think is actually quite important in order to think about like what is platypus giving an education in, but also how, which actually is important. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to think.
I'll make one suggestion, by the way, which is that I'm sure that other people had questions that were more germane to the original topic, and so if others are okay with it, I'd be willing to close my own thread here.
I think I have to think about your question more. I maybe can get back to you on that later, but I think that's something I gotta to pontificate on. Okay. June, you had a question?
I wanted a comment more than anything. Hi, I'm a contact new person here. And I definitely agree with Gabe a lot of times that when people talk to each other, they kind of like, if you're not familiar with any of this, I had a background in it, but I just knew the word dialectic and that was about it. That I can kind of, the way they talk to each other seems very strange because they use these words like negative and positive relation, object and subject. And it's like, what are you talking about? So I definitely agree with like, I don't know, Gabe's saying this, but it's like, I think the point of like the Hegel reading is just like a way to get into the dialectics and the thing that's so fundamental to platypus, because if you don't understand these kinds of things, then platypus seems wholly of some strange esoteric project where through the negativity of the left you can constitute something. Like to anybody that's not understanding of that, that just seems like you're just like trying to imagine words. So I would say that
right?
Yeah, it's very jarring. And I would say that constantly throughout, like, I've been almost here the entire syllabus. I would say that I have literally asked Evie over here to like explain a lot of this to me directly one-on-one to actually like get a lot of this. So that's why I'm kind of like pro-ing I'm sitting in the Hegel reading group to actually think that like.
Well, we're not arguing against doing the reading group. We're trying to interrogate why we're doing it.
Oh, okay. Well, never mind.
Yeah. Delaney, you had a question earlier? No?
Well, it was vague. It wasn't even related to the notes I was taking. It was just a question about so I guess there's a problem in philosophy of when something is a circular, if something is circular reasoning, that's basically a critique. Like that's a criticism. Like we should be doing better than like giving circular reasoning. We should be doing better than giving a circular definition. Like that's like part of the Socratic dialectic, I think, is like showing that, oh, what is piety, and then if what is pious is just, what the gods love and gods love pious things, or I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was circular, and people were offended by Socrates bringing out this sort of like circularity because it was this understanding that it was that we should be doing better than that that's not a reason, that's just I don't know, you're like running and trying to catch your own tail. So I guess my question is going to be kind of abstract, but is there always not supposed to, but is there a critique against Hegel that his system is closed and thus circular, and then Marx almost like opens it up and makes it like calls upon like continuing like historical events and like an appeal to something transcendent as a way of like always keeping that system open, because as soon as we close it we're gonna fall into like circular reasoning and like kind of dogmatism. Does that question even make sense?
The problem with Hegel is not that he's circular. I mean, he is circular, but he's circular in the sense that history leads back to itself. History leads to, I mean, it's a dialectical circularity, right? Like, you can only make sense of things in the context of the totality. And so, like, the total, in understanding, the logic proceeds, I mean, he's proceeding from the standpoint that history has brought him to. So in that sense, he's mediated by history. But as a philosophical system, it is circular. Is that a problem? Well, Hegel would say no, because his system is self-justifying. I mean, in a certain sense, what Hegel is trying to articulate is that reason is self-justifying. You can't make sense of anything without reason. And so, like, in taking reason to make sense, yeah, that is circular, because you have to take reason in order to take reason to make sense. But it's self-justifying because, you know, you can only make sense of things using that reason in the first place. So, and the claim that nothing makes sense, already that requires reason, because that means you've got some idea of what makes sense. So I would say that the problem then becomes that history moves beyond Hegel in the fact that bourgeois society comes into crisis. You can't simply say that Hegel is circular and so he's wrong. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
I would love for you to talk more about the relationship between politics and philosophy.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that is kind of the problem that we're raising.
I mean, what do you have a specific question?
Well, within the context of the philosophy dispute, there is this kind of idea that, you know, there is this, I guess, a priori ahistorical justification we can somehow find
right
for a certain political orientation and method. And I take, you know, I mean, if I've understood your teaching correctly, I take your point to be that they're kind of divorced from each other in a very peculiar sense. And I just would like, I guess I'm kind of curious as to, you know, I'm sorry I don't have a very fine point on this question, but how do you understand that relationship between these two domains? Like, because obviously you're saying it's important. Like, you know, you yourself felt this need to go back, you know, to engage in philosophy to try and understand something that's ultimately addressing a political deficit, you know, platypus. So I don't know. I mean, even if it's just, you know, like freely associating on the point, I would be curious to see what your thoughts are on the relationship between those.
I mean, like, I feel like, how do I put this? Like, I feel like actually my third diagram sort of gets at this point, which is like, what is the relationship of Hegelianism and Marxism? It's the conscious reflex of bourgeois society and capitalism. Now, Marxism isn't divorced in the sense that it's unrelated to Hegelianism. It's a dialectical development on Hegelianism that's in crisis with it. And so the task that the real task that Marxism presents is that the conscious reflex actually goes back the other way, back to bourgeois society and capitalism. So the really, like, I feel like philosophy is like, it's almost like I feel this also gets sort of the point between idealism and materialism, where like, why is Marx a materialist? And that's because there's like,
Would it be okay if I potentially tried to give a finer edge to my question?
Yeah,
to
sure.
Correct you. So you know, you're making this point that Marxism comes out of the disintegration of Hegelianism.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. But Marxism understood itself as this kind of, ultimately a political attempt to navigate and change reality, and it failed rather dramatically.
Sure.
So in light of that, is there a kind of, I guess, which gets priority of these two? Do we need to go back to philosophy in light of the failure of Marxism? Or is it something that philosophy needs to try and understand Marxism? And, like which which is prior?
I think there's,
if either.
I mean, I think again, it comes down to sort of the relationship. I mean, it's again related to the relationship between idealism and materialism, which is the relationship between the ability to consciously grasp reality and then the question as to whether like, I just totally lost your question. What was it again?
Basically, in light of the failure of Marxism's
Oh, right.
attempt
Which
at
one's prior?
politics,
Which
well,
one's...
it's which, like, in light of the failure of Marxism's failure, where does Marxism stand in relationship to philosophy? Is really the question. Is there any use for it?
I mean, so there's two sort of prongs to this question that I can think of. There's the question of philosophy, and then there's the question of, because philosophy is sort of like self-satisfied. It's something that has to be whole within itself. It can't be insufficient because that would cede something to the unconscious. Like philosophy is the conscious grasp of society. And Marxism, the point a Marxism would make is that there is sort of an unconscious element that needs to be dealt with. And so the question is there something that comes prior to Marxism philosophically? No. But do we need some sort of theoretical framework to understand Marxism? I sort of take your question to be? Yeah. I mean, what is Marxism? Is it like, I mean, if all it is I feel like I'm sort of waffling over terms here.
That's fine. He was.
Yeah.
Engels considers himself that. In the end of classical German philosophy and with Ludwig Feuerbach and all that, he has a comment about how, Hegel was explicitly a kind of revolutionary character. And he kind of attacks people who just paint him wholly as conservative. The point is that there's a kind of methodologically revolutionary side, at least the way Engels puts it, and then that kind of system that is problematic.
I would take it in particular the relationship that Marx stands to Hegel is that Hegel is the highest conscious reflex of the consciousness of bourgeois society. And so the sort of arrow that points from Marxism back to Hegelianism here is the understanding that, like, there needs to be an understanding, there needs to be like an attempt to grasp society self-consciously. and Hegel is the best, not the best, but like the dialectical method is really the only attempt to do so. So while it's not like it's like a question of what kind of consciousness is adequate to changing society, rather than what is true, what is the metaphysical presuppositions of Marxism. No, it's what level, what kind of consciousness is adequate to grasp society, or to attempt to grasp society. Does that answer your question?
I think that's a good way of going about it. The thing is that's one of the things I was wanting to raise, is that it seems that politics and philosophy are kind of fundamentally different ways of thinking and working through these issues, and I think of Gillian Rose and her point that Marxism is a form of cognition kind of sui generis, that it's unto itself in a certain respect, because it's getting at really this disintegration and breakdown within society as a whole, in hopes of trying to consciously navigate it and overcome it. But so would you frame it as that you think philosophy is inadequate to that task?
The form of philosophy is certainly inadequate to the task of grasping society consciously. But the reason why Marxism stands in relationship to Hegelianism is that the content of Hegelian philosophy is in a sense necessary to grasp society.
Ben, could you expand upon Ben, could you expand upon your comment in the chat, please? Thanks.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I don't know who said this from the audience, but about the distinction between politics and philosophy. Korsch's intervention in Marxism and philosophy is exactly that. That's not the case. Mm-hmm. At least in some kind of like absolute epistemological way, that like politics teaches you differently than philosophy, but rather that what the generative moment for Marxism is society as totality. And so philosophy and politics may appear differently, and as a result may reveal different insights for consciousness, but the critical consciousness recognizes that they follow from the same dialectical contradiction at the root of society.
Yeah.
Rather, what's maybe a way to put it is that the fact that politics and philosophy seem to be in contradiction with one another actually betrays a relationship.
I mean, to me, like, philosophy and politics are both attempts at grasping society consciously, and it's just that the form of philosophy comes to be outstripped. Now,
yes.
So yes, yeah. I mean, like, that's what I was trying to get at with the form-content distinction, is that there's that philosophy methodologically in the way it attempts to grapple with reality is insufficient, but the attempt to grapple with reality is the same between philosophy and politics in a certain sense. Okay. Are we good? Are we done? Oh, Gabe.
Last question.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, and it goes back to this idea, which I think is also what's controversial in Hegel, maybe.
There's a lot controversial.
There is a lot, but this in particular, and this is from the Freedom and History section. So you say, in this way, the constitution of the bourgeois state is what allows Hegel to declare that his moment is the end of history, in that the rational and free idea is realized in it.
Yes.
And I think we could say, well, specifically, like the Prussian state in like 1820 or 1830 or whatever, like saying that Hegel is like now declaring at the end of history. I think that the the breakdown of Hegelianism is partly related to, I don't know, the danger in such an idea, maybe, in that Hegel's view. So I'm trying to formulate a question out of this, but it's really just the idea of like this idea of the teleology of the present, meaning Hegel, from his standpoint, from the present moment, you can say all of history is leading to this and is now completed in this free society we live in. But to what extent does Hegel account for the possibility? Well, I guess two things. One, the possibility of the continuation of the bourgeois revolution beyond his moment, and what does he think like? What does he think that might look like? And two, does Hegel account for the possibility of the breakdown of the bourgeois revolution?
Right.
And in some ways, capitalism is both, meaning it's the continuation of the bourgeois revolution and its breakdown. And so, to what extent, when we say end of history, that sounds like a conservative idea, straightforwardly. But to what extent does Hegel mean it in a way that is actually not so one-sided? Maybe that's not really a question, but you get what I mean.
So there's a finer point to be put on this, which is, what does Hegel mean by the end of history? And I tried to be somewhat clear about this, but I don't think it's super obvious just from the presentation. We're free. It's the end of history in that we have come to self-consciousness of our freedom. And how is that expressed? Well, it's expressed in the concept of the state. Not the state, the concept of the state. So the state, we have realized that the purpose of the state in bourgeois society is to realize human subjectivity. But he wasn't saying per se that the Prussian state was the final developed form of the state. And in fact, there are indications he maybe didn't believe that.
And yet that's how the right Hegelians intend
Yes,
to take it.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. So now I don't know if Hegel accounted for the possibility that like the appearance of reason, of our grasp of reason being self-conscious would come out to be just an appearance, like the seeming unity between like our freedom, our reason, and the concept of our reason like comes to fall out of unity. I don't know if Hegel accounted.
We didn't need to, yeah.
Yeah, but like, I mean, I think the thing is that like there were already unconscious forces like in the sense that capital is sort of developing in the background, and nobody's like, I mean, there's no real need to grasp it because it's sort of like, it's not like this relevant force that's imposing itself on society. But it is, I mean, well, is it there? I mean, in retrospect, we could maybe say so, but like, I don't know. Like, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I guess what I'm thinking is in retrospect, we can say, well, one of the potentialities within Hegelianism was Marxism. It's coming out of Hegel's own like philosophy and its movement in history.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any other questions? No.
Thank you so much for doing the teaching, Evie. This has been a great pleasure.